Visual Basic Guided Tour, 5 Steps to Creating Your First Program. The best way to learn Visual Basic programming is to actually create a program. A good first program is a web browsing application that can display web pages. I'll show you how to create a project in Visual Basic, put the user interface together, add a line of Visual Basic code, and then test your program. Step 1. Create a project in Visual Basic. In this lesson, you will learn to create a project. In later lessons, you will use this project to create your first program. First, click the Start menu and then click Microsoft Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition. When the application opens, you'll see the Integrated Development Environment, or IDE for short. To create a project, click File, click New Project, and in the New Project dialog box, select a Windows application. Since this is the first application that you're creating, it automatically names it Windows Application 1. Click OK on this dialog box and it will create your project. Now notice it created a form called Form 1 in an area of the IDE known as the Form Designer. And all of the required files are located in an area of the IDE called Solution Explorer. Now this is all that was needed to create a project in Visual Basic. In the next lesson, you'll learn how to create a user interface for your program. Step 2. Create a user interface. In this lesson, you'll learn how to create a user interface for your program by adding controls to the form you created in Step 1. To add controls to your application, you can drag the controls from the toolbox. In my IDE, the toolbox is hidden, so I'll point to the Toolbox tab on the sidebar to open it, and I'll pin it in place so that it's easier to use. If for some reason the toolbox is not visible at all, not even in the sidebar, click the View menu and then click Toolbox and it will open it. Notice that you can open other windows from this menu as well, such as Solution Explorer and the Properties window. I'll click the All Windows Form tab to see a list of all of the Windows Forms controls that are available to me. Currently I have them in alphabetical order, but if for some reason yours are not in alphabetical order, you can right-click and then select Sort Items Alphabetically. I'll scroll down and click a panel control and drag it to the upper left-hand corner of my form. I'll use the panel control to hold my user input controls in a defined area that is separate from the web browser display area that I want to have in the lower part of the form. Now I'll get a button control and place it directly on top of the panel control. I'll move the button a little bit by clicking on it and then dragging it to a new area, then releasing the mouse button. Now I'll drag a label and then a text box control onto the panel, and finally I'll drag a web browser control and put it directly below the panel. It doesn't look very good now, but in the next lesson you'll learn how to customize the look and behavior of your program. Step 3. Customize looks and behavior. In Step 2, you added all of the necessary controls to your program, but it looks rough and unfinished. In this lesson, you'll learn how to set the properties of the controls to change their appearance. To set the properties of your controls, you can select the control on the Forms Designer, and then notice in the Properties window of the IDE that it lists all of the properties for this particular selected control, such as the color, the size, the name, and the position. I want to set the position by using the Dock property. I'll select Dock, and then I'm going to click the little drop-down arrow, and it gives me the option to dock the control to the top, left, right, or bottom, or to fill all of the available space. I'm going to choose top. And notice that the panel control is docked to the top of the form and expands to the entire width of my form. I'm also going to select the sizing handle of the panel control and just move it up so that it takes up less space on my form. The other thing I want to do is, since the application is going to be a web browser, I want it to be a little bit bigger than the default form size. So I'm going to select the form and notice the sizing handles, and I'm going to click this corner sizing handle and then just drag it down to resize the form. Next, I'll select the button control and drag it over to this area of my web browser, and then scroll down to the text property and type in Go with an exclamation mark, and press the Enter key. Notice that it changed the name on the button. And then I'll select the Label control and change its text property to URL. Next, I'll reposition the text box and then select one of the sizing handles and drag it to the right so that it can accommodate a long website URL if I type one in. Next, I'll just realign the remaining controls within the panel, and then I'll select the web browser control and set its dock property to fill, and notice that it expands to fill the remaining space on the form below the panel control. Now it looks the way I want it to, but it doesn't do anything. In the next lesson, you'll learn how to make the browser work by adding some Visual Basic code to your application. Step 4. Add Visual Basic code. In this lesson, I'll show you how to add some instructions for how the program should work. You add these instructions by adding Visual Basic code to your application. In the Form Designer, double-click the button control and it will open up a new window called the Code Editor. And notice that there's already some code here and the cursor is in between these two lines. The top one says private sub button1 underscore click, and then there's some variables in parentheses, and the bottom one says end sub. Most of the code you write will be inside sub-procedures like this one. These procedures react to or handle events, in this case, clicking the button as the name of the procedure implies. So whenever a user clicks button 1, the code that you type in this area will run. So to add the code and make the web browser read a URL from the text box and display the web page, type webbrowser1, that's the name of the web browser control that we added, type in dot, and then type navigate, add a parentheses, and then type in textbox1, this is the name given to the text box we added to the form, followed by a dot, and text, and then an end parentheses. Now if you don't understand what this code means, don't worry too much about it right now. You're going to learn a lot more about writing code in later lessons. In the next lesson, you'll learn how to test your application. Step 5. Run and test your program. In this lesson, I'll show you how to run and test your program. Before you start, make sure that your computer is connected to the internet so that you can actually get to a website. To test the browser, you can click the Debug menu and then click Start Debugging. Visual Basic Express starts running your program, and it's called debugging because if there are bugs in your program, you get messages that pop up and tell you more or less what's wrong. When the application runs, you see Form 1 open in front of Visual Basic Express. Now you can type in a URL in the text box and then click the Go button. So I'll go ahead and type in the URL for Microsoft.com, that's www.microsoft.com, and then click Go. And notice that it opens up the Microsoft.com main web page. I can expand this application if I want to see more of the web page, and I have my scroll bar that I can scroll up and down. Now to close the application, I'll click the X in the upper right-hand corner of the application. This concludes the Visual Basic guided tour for creating your first Visual Basic program. You can get more details from the Visual Basic documentation. This video shows the results of 5 help topics that are in the section called Creating Your First Visual Basic Program. You can find the topics on msdn2.microsoft.com under Visual Studio, Visual Basic Guided Tour, Creating Your First Visual Basic Program.